In a world full of noise, it's easy to think that the more you say, the more you're heard. But what if I told you that the power isn't in speaking more, but in speaking less? What if your words could carry weight without being endless? Today, we're going to discover how learning the art of saying less can actually make you stand out more. Stay tuned, because mastering this simple skill might just change the way people listen to you forever. In the bustling streets of Chicago, there was a man named Elijah who spent his days on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Jackson Street. He wasn't like most of the beggars people often passed by without a second glance. His clothes were ragged, his beard unkempt, and his face weathered by years of hardship. But there was something different about Elijah. He never spoke a word. Every day, Elijah would sit on the sidewalk with a small cardboard sign that simply read, "Please help, God bless." People walked by, some ignoring him, some tossing him spare change, others offering a quick glance of sympathy. But he said nothing. No begging, no pleading, no words to gain attention. Most people would think that the more you speak, the more people would take notice. But Elijah had learned something over the years: sometimes, saying less speaks volumes. One day, a businessman named Mark was rushing to his office, as he did every morning. He had an important meeting and couldn't afford to waste time. But as he passed Elijah, something stopped him. For some reason, today was different. He looked at the beggar sitting quietly with his sign. No words. No pleading. Just a calm stillness. Mark, usually immune to the faces he passed daily, felt a pang of guilt. Why was this man sitting in silence while everyone else was caught up in their busy lives? What was he trying to communicate? Without thinking, Mark stopped. He fumbled through his pockets and pulled out a $20 bill. He walked up to Elijah, handed him the money, and said, "Here's something for you today." Elijah took the bill with a soft nod, and still, no words came from his lips. As Mark turned to leave, he noticed something about Elijah. Despite his tattered clothes and the evident struggles he must have faced, there was a sense of peace in him. A quiet strength. In that moment, Mark realized that Elijah's silence had made him think, something words might not have been able to do. The days passed, and Mark found himself thinking about Elijah more and more. Each time he passed him on his way to work, he noticed that the beggar would remain silent, still, and calm, yet his presence spoke louder than anything Mark had ever heard. It was almost as though Elijah had mastered the art of saying less. One day, Mark couldn't resist the urge to talk to him. He sat down beside Elijah, careful not to disturb his peace. "I've been thinking about you lately," Mark began. "I see you here every day, but you don't speak to anyone. Why don't you say something? People would give you more if they knew your story." Elijah simply looked at him and replied, "What would words change? People hear what they want to hear. When you talk too much, you often lose the power of your voice. Saying less means your words have weight. If I speak, it's because it matters. Not to make noise, but to make a difference." Mark was taken aback. He had never thought about it that way. Here was a man, with nothing to his name, who seemed to understand one of the most important principles of life, the power of speaking less but speaking with purpose. Weeks turned into months, and Mark found himself in regular conversation with Elijah. They spoke very little, but every time, Elijah's words had an impact. The more Mark listened, the more he realized that life wasn't about filling every silence with words, but about using your words wisely when the time was right. One evening, Mark found himself in a high-stakes business meeting. The pressure was on, and he knew the wrong words could sink everything he'd worked for. His heart raced, and his mind went blank. But then, he remembered Elijah. He took a deep breath, calmed his nerves, and instead of speaking hastily, he carefully chose his words. He made his points with precision, allowing each statement to land with power. His calm and calculated approach impressed his colleagues. The meeting went better than he could have hoped, and Mark realized that the lessons he had learned from Elijah had helped him in ways he couldn't have imagined. A few weeks later, Mark found himself in the same spot on Fifth Avenue, but this time, he wasn't in a rush. He had something important to say. He sat down beside Elijah, who was still quietly holding his sign. "I've learned something from you," Mark said, looking him in the eye. "Your silence has taught me the power of saying less. Words are powerful, but they lose their value when we use them too much. What you taught me wasn't about begging for help, it was about how to speak with impact, when to speak, and when to let your silence do the talking." Elijah's eyes softened, and for the first time in all their encounters, he smiled. The world is full of noise. But the most powerful thing you can do is silence it and make your words matter. When you don't show everything, when you don't tell it all, you leave people wanting more. And that's when you have their attention. Mark sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on what Elijah had just said. It was the most powerful lesson he had ever received, and it didn't come from a business school or a seminar. It came from a man who had nothing but the ability to speak with purpose. Mark's life was never the same again. He approached his career, his relationships, and even his daily life with a newfound sense of awareness. He became a man of few words but great impact. When he spoke, people listened, not because he was loud, but because they knew his words held weight. And as for Elijah, he continued to sit at his corner by the railway tracks, never speaking too much, but always speaking with purpose. His quiet strength became a symbol in the neighborhood, a reminder that you don't need to speak constantly to be heard. You don't need to show off to make an impact. Sometimes, saying less means you're saying everything that truly matters. Moral of the story. Words are powerful, but only when used wisely. Sometimes, the less you speak, the more you have to say. Speak with purpose, not noise. In a world full of distractions, choose to make your voice count. And so, in the silence of the beggar's words, we find the truth, that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in saying less, in speaking with intention, and letting our actions do the talking. His life wasn't just about surviving on the streets, it was about learning the value of restraint, and how, through his silence, he earned the respect of those around him. His story reminds us that we don't need to shout to be heard, and we don't need to show off to prove our worth. In a world full of noise, true power comes from the wisdom of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. If you found strength in this story, and you believe in the power of saying less and making a bigger impact, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join the Deep Down Motivation community, where we share stories that inspire and empower. And remember, it's not about how much you say, it's about what you say and how you make it count. Keep speaking less and living more. See you in the next story.